Before Lyndon Baines Johnson took on the role of Vice President of the United States on January 20th, 1961, he was the most powerful man in the U.S. Senate. Some might say that he was the most powerful senator in modern history. Some might even say he is the most powerful senator that we have had since the founding of these United States. But nonetheless, he was powerful. But in order to get that power, he had to be elected to the U.S. Senate. In this video, we're going to talk about the 1948 Texas Democratic primary runoff for the U.S. Senate between Coke Stevenson, a former governor of Texas, and Lyndon Johnson, a young and fiery congressman from Texas Hill Country's 10th Congressional District. My name is Dave. Welcome to Election History, a channel focused on the history of elections, campaigns, political parties, candidates, and so on. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe and like the video as well. If you want to support the channel, you can do that by joining my Patreon. The link is below in the pinned comment. Before we get into the topic of the 1948 Democratic runoff in Texas, I just want to say that this is just an overview of the runoff election to give you an idea of what happened. If you really want to get in depth, I highly recommend reading Robert Caro's book, Means of Ascent, which is part of his masterful biographical collection about Lyndon Johnson. The source for almost everything presented here in this video is from Caro's book, so I highly recommend checking it out. The election for U.S. Senate in Texas in 1948 was a battle of ideology as well as age. Congressman Lyndon Johnson was a young FDR Democrat who supported the New Deal, but was conservative on other issues. His main opponent was former Democratic Texas Governor Coke Stevens, who was considered a staunchly conservative Democrat. There were 11 candidates in the primary in total, but these two were the main candidates. Both Johnson and Stevenson had broad statewide support. Still, a May 16th poll showed that Stevenson was winning 64% of the vote to Johnson's 28% of the vote. When it came to favorability, 49% of the voters had a good opinion of Stevenson, with only 31 saying the same for Johnson. However, Johnson was still unknown by 34% of those polled, compared to only 9% for Stevenson. Johnson had a lot more room to make up ground, and at the same time, 62% of those polled had a not-so-good opinion of Pappy O'Daniel, making him the most unpopular politician in the state. Oh, and by the way, in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, they show Pappy O'Daniel as the governor of Mississippi, which is incorrect. He is the former governor and senator of Texas. When it came to campaigning, Johnson rented a helicopter and flew around the state to both urban cities and rural farmlands. His campaign was based on strong support for the New Deal, as well as the role of the United States in world affairs. Proudly wearing his silver star that he had won in 1942, Johnson accused Stevenson of being an isolationist and that Stevenson would allow communism to go unchecked. Johnson was also a, let's just say, extremely energized candidate who had his good and his bad sides. He would even start criticizing people in the crowd if they didn't wildly cheer for him. As for Stevenson, who talked about his record as governor, he had a demeanor of a statesman. Basically, he was the exact opposite of Johnson. Still, Johnson relentlessly attacked Stevenson on everything from his opposition to FDR, to his isolationist views, to his weight and being obese. But Stevenson really never responded to these attacks, which is always a dumb strategy, just as Michael Dukakis 40 years later. A poll taken just a few days before the primary showed Lyndon Johnson in the lead. The last Texas poll by Joe Belden showed Johnson with 42% support to Stevenson's 39% support. Belden also said that, quote, Johnson takes the lead in this poll not because he has more supporters than Stevenson amongst all the qualified voters interviewed, but because his supporters appear more certain than Stevenson's to turn out to vote. Still, with no majority, this race was looking more likely to be headed to a runoff. On primary election day, July 24th, Coke Stevenson won 39.68% of the vote, with Johnson winning 33.73%. Since no candidate in the primary received over 50% of the votes, the top two vote getters would battle in a runoff. Much of the same rhetoric that dominated the primary election also dominated the runoff. Johnson continued to focus on communism as his main issue, saying that Stevenson hadn't provided a strong stance on fighting communism. Stevenson continued to say that he had improved Texas and that Johnson had done almost nothing for his constituents since being elected to Congress. The day before the runoff election, another poll was conducted by George Belden that showed that Stevenson was leading Johnson 53% to 47%, but still with the same caveat as before that Johnson voters were more likely to turn out to go to the polls than Stevenson's voters. Belden predicted that Stevenson would win by a closer margin, 51% to 49%. The Johnson campaign knew that it would be close, but they would still need to find more votes before Election Day. As Johnson's biographer Robert Caro said, Johnson had gained on Koch, but he hadn't gained enough. He was going to come close, but he was still going to lose. This meant that Johnson needed to find votes and to prepare for the possible outcome of a close result on election night. Oh, and when I mean finding votes, I mean buying, stealing, and making up votes. The Johnson campaign knew that they could find votes in two different ways. The first way was to buy votes from non-white voters who usually didn't participate in elections. Again, according to Robert Caro, the biggest block of voters that could be bought were in West San Antonio's large Hispanic neighborhoods. While most Hispanic voters were actually supportive of Stevenson, the local postmaster, Dan Quill, informed Johnson that he could do much better in San Antonio. Johnson enlisted the help of Quill, who had the power to move votes due to his patronization jobs through the post office. But the most powerful person to push votes toward Johnson was Owen Kilday, the sheriff of Bexar County. Kilday and his deputies would round up Mexican Americans and, according to future Texas Governor John Connally, get paid between $250 and $500 per carload of essentially captured voters. Connally would go on to say that he wouldn't be surprised if Johnson had paid over $50,000 to win votes in San Antonio. There were other counties in the Rio Grande Valley that could be bought as well. The person that was the big boss in this region was George Parr, also known as the Duke of Duval because he was from Duval County. But the Parr political machine stretched beyond Duval County to Starr County, LaSalle, Jim Hogg County, Zapata County, and Brooks County, and Jim Wells County. Interestingly, LBJ's father, Sam Johnson, worked with Parr to unseat a Republican congressman in 1928. The Republican lost the election, but the House seated him anyways because of the voter fraud in the election. So the Johnson family had a connection to the Parr family at least 20 years before the 1948 election. The second way to find votes was to simply make up results. There had always been rumors that George Parr would simply make up his own numbers regardless of what the votes were and submit those numbers to the Texas Election Bureau. While people knew it was probably happening, nobody really focused on it because it hadn't really had an impact, with the exception of the 1928 congressional race that I mentioned earlier. This means that if Parr held the votes from certain precincts on election night, he could simply change the number to give a certain candidate more votes to win. On the night of the runoff, August 28th, the race was really close. Numbers would go back and forth between the candidates. This wasn't unusual, as some counties would take longer to count because of the rural votes. Also, numbers would change because of clerical errors when reporting the numbers, or the numbers being misunderstood when being read over the phone. So this was common. In places like San Antonio, they had recently employed the use of voting machines, which would help them calculate the final vote. These voting machines also made it hard for votes to be added once the voting was complete. In Bexar County, where San Antonio is located, Johnson won only 24% of the vote in the first primary, finishing third place. But in the runoff, he won the county by 99 votes. Also, between the first primary and the runoff, Stevenson had lost 9,140 votes, so the tactics of the Johnson campaign of buying votes in Bexar County seemed to have paid off. By September 3rd, Coke Stevenson had a 255 vote lead over Lyndon Johnson, but Johnson was confident, saying that he was absolutely sure he would have a majority when the official vote was canvassed, saying that he had carefully checked with his friends throughout the state. Surely one of those friends was George Parr. A day later, and 6 days after the runoff, Johnson moved into the lead with 44 votes. Johnson had gained 202 votes from Jim Wells County, with Stevenson only gaining 2 votes. This was the Duke of Duval's backyard. Also, when the votes were originally tallied on election night, they reported 765 votes for Johnson. However, this new batch of votes showed Johnson's total to be 965. This wasn't the only odd thing happening in George Parr's domain. Johnson had also won 93% of the vote in all of the counties combined and 99% of the vote in Duval County. Another problem in this vote was the unusually high turnout. According to Robert Caro, of the 4,679 people who were eligible to vote in Duval County, 4,662 had actually voted. This would have been a 99.6% turnout rate. And of those 4,662 who had voted, 4,622 had voted for Lyndon Johnson. The state as a whole had a turnout of 57%. So these numbers coming out of Duval County were highly irregular. Another problem, and the problem mostly associated with this election, is that of the returns from Jim Wells County, particularly in the town of Alice. As you might remember, 202 votes showed up for Johnson 6 days after the election. Feeling that something was suspicious, Stevenson wanted the results to be examined. At first, he sent a few attorneys down to Alice, Texas to take a look at the tally sheets, basically a voter roll that showed who voted. But when the attorneys asked to see the tally, which was located in a bank safe in Alice, they were turned down, even though looking at the tally was perfectly legal and a public record. The bank clerk, Tom Donald, who was also the secretary of the Jim Wells County Democratic Party, said that they couldn't see the records because, quote, the vault was locked and he didn't want to unlock the vault. But the Democratic Party in Jim Wells County weren't totally on the side of George Parr. Known as the Reform members of the party, one member, B.M. Brownlee, had told Stevenson's attorneys that he had seen a tally sheet that the ink on it for the last 200 voters were in a different color, changing from black ink to blue ink. Harry Lee Adams, the new chairman of the Democratic Executive Committee of Jim Wells County, was also able to see the tally list. He also confirmed that the ink, starting with voter number 842, and those listed afterwards, were written in blue ink, while those prior were written in black ink. After the incident on Friday, September 10th, Stevenson went down himself, accompanied by Frank Hammer, a legendary Texas Ranger who is known as one of the people who organized the ambush that gunned down the notorious Bonnie and Clyde crime duo. Stevenson entered the bank and asked Tom Donald to see the list. At first, Donald refused, but then did allow Stevenson and his attorneys to see the list. As soon as the attorneys started to write down some of the names, Donald pulled the list away from them and told them that they couldn't look at it anymore. But they already had a few names and numbers of people who they could ask to see if they had voted or not. Stevenson's attorneys noticed that the ink had changed, as was mentioned by the Reform Democrats who had seen the list before, but they also noticed that all the names were in alphabetical order and written in the same handwriting. This was surely the smoking gun that showed that voter fraud had actually taken place. They also had written down the name of voter 841, the last name on the list that was still in black ink, because surely this had to be the last voter on the list. In addition to the names on the list, the voter tally number, the number of votes cast for each candidate, seemed to have been altered. It said that Johnson had received 965 votes, but it appeared that a loop was added to the 7 to give an appearance of a 9. This further indicates that the 200 or so votes were added after the initial reporting of votes. With this information, Stevenson's attorney went around asking questions. The first person they questioned was voter 841, the last name in black ink. That voter said that at 6:40 p.m., 20 minutes before the polls closed, and seeing how nobody was around, he assumed that he was the last person to vote. Interviewing the same names after that voter, the ones in blue ink and in the same handwriting, none of them said that they had voted that day. Hector Cerda, a college student, wasn't even in town that day and was over 100 miles away. Still, he had been added on the list as having voted. The problem for Stevenson was that the Texas Democratic Party was going to name their nominee for the U.S. Senate at their state's convention on Monday, September 13th, which was only 3 days away. The convention usually approves the recommendation of the Texas Democratic Party's executive committee, and the executive committee usually recommends the report from the canvassing subcommittee. And at this time, Johnson had an 87-vote lead over Stevenson. If Stevenson didn't have the numbers changed by that time that the committee met, then Johnson would probably be the nominee. Stevenson had two ways to fight this. First, he could take legal action to have the votes in Precinct 13 recounted, as well as provide evidence of fraud from the tally sheet and the poll tax roll that Tom Donald had refused to release. With this, the Jim Wells Democratic Party could change the votes and submit a revised number to the Texas Democratic Party, which would give Stevenson the win. But this all had to be done before the executive committee met, and it would be better if it had been done before the canvassing subcommittee met at 10 a.m. on Monday. But on that Friday, the same day that Stevenson was in Jim Wells County, Lyndon Johnson filed an affidavit with a judge in Austin to stop the counting of the votes in Jim Wells County, saying that Stevenson's and others entered into a conspiracy for the purpose of causing the votes in precinct number 13 in Jim Wells County to be thrown out on the grounds of fraud and irregularity. The argument also said that changing the results would cause Johnson irreparable harm if the county party continued with its counting. With this, Johnson asked for a restraining order to be issued to stop the counting of votes until the case could be heard in front of a judge in Jim Wells County. If this sounds extremely familiar to you, that counting the votes would cause irreparable harm to a candidate, it should, because this is exactly the same tactics that George Bush used against Al Gore in the Florida hand recount in 2000. The problem for Stevenson is that the local judge in Jim Wells County, Lorenz Broder, said that he wouldn't hear the argument until Monday, which was the same day that the Texas Democratic Party canvassing subcommittee and executive committee were going to meet to name the nominee. Therefore, Judge Broder had to hand down his decision before the canvassing board met at 10 a.m. on Monday, a near impossible task. The second way for Stevenson to win the fight was by lobbying the Texas Democratic Party's executive committee to reject any recommendations from the canvassing committee that had Johnson in the lead based on what Stephen perceived as a fraudulent vote. Most of the people on that executive committee supported Stevenson, but there were a number of liberals on that committee as well, with the threat of the Democratic Party at the presidential level being split between loyal Democrats supporting President Harry Truman and renegade Democrats supporting a possible third party run by Strom Thurmond. Johnson made a deal with the Truman supporters to have the delegates to the state convention that he controlled support the delegates at a national convention that were loyal to Truman. This led to Johnson gaining support on the executive committee. On Monday, the Texas Democratic Party canvassing committee decided to wait until they heard further news out of Jim Wells County before they made their recommendation to the executive committee. At 3 p.m., word came in from Jim Wells County that Judge Broder sided with Lyndon Johnson and votes would not be counted in Precinct 13. Still sensing that there was some possible voter fraud, at 5 p.m., the canvassing subcommittee voted 4-3 for a recommendation that would certify the results of 251 of Texas's 254 counties, excluding Jim Wells County. The other two counties excluded did not hold primaries. There is also a minority report by the 3 members voting against the exclusion of Jim Wells County, keeping the numbers as is. The executive committee would meet at 7 p.m. At 9:48 p.m., the executive committee decided to first vote on the minority report, which would include Jim Wells County. The vote initially passed 29-28, with 1 vote not being cast. However, 1 member changed their vote, Mrs. Seth Dorbath, who voted for Johnson originally, but then changed her vote to being present and not voting, hoping that this would be settled in the courts. So now the vote was tied 28-28. The one vote that had been absent on the first ballot was Charlie C. Gibson of Amarillo, who intended to vote for Johnson but wasn't present. John Connolly found Gibson, got him back to the ballroom, and voted for the minority report. Johnson, therefore, won the executive committee battle. Oh, and by the way, Wikipedia says that the deciding vote was cast by Frank W. Mayborn, but this is incorrect, as Robert Caro and contemporaneous news reports at the time confirmed that it was indeed Charles C. Gibson. Remember, even if there's a citation, Wikipedia isn't always right. So Johnson's side had won. The whole convention approved the minority report as well. He was now the party's nominee. But Stevenson wasn't finished with his fight. If he couldn't win in the state courts or the party convention, he'd take his battle to the federal government. Stevenson's attorneys wrote a petition asking for a temporary restraining order against Johnson's name being placed on the ballot due to fraud. Federal Judge Whitfield Davidson signed the petition granting the restraining and set a hearing on September 21st as to whether there should be a federal injunction. Both sides presented their arguments. Stevenson's side said that this was a civil rights violation because of the unfair counting of votes due to fraud. Johnson's side argued that the counting of votes was not a federal matter, but a state matter, and that a party's nomination of a candidate was also not the responsibility of the federal government, but of a political party itself. Davidson did not agree with Johnson's attorneys, saying that there needed to be some sort of recourse for people who felt that fraud had been committed against them. With the strong proof that Stevenson's side presented in court, Davidson appointed 2 masters of chancery who had full subpoena power and asked for evidence. The investigation was to be concluded on October 2nd, the day before the deadline for placing names on the ballot, which was October 3rd. Johnson decided to go ahead and move forward with an appeal, enlisting the help of future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas. The problem was that the Circuit Court of Appeals wouldn't meet until October 4th, one day after the deadline to place a name on the ballot. Therefore, even if the court was able to hear the case, Johnson's name would still be left off the ballot. Another issue was that if Johnson went to an appellate justice to ask for a stay, it was highly unlikely that a single judge would overrule another judge, as it usually required multiple judges to stay a lower court's order. But this was actually Fortas's plan. He wanted a single circuit court justice to quickly reject Johnson's appeal for a stay so that they could then submit a request for a stay to the Supreme Court and Justice Hugo Black, who was more likely to issue a stay on the investigation before October 3rd and placing Johnson's name on the ballot. With that, Luther Jones, one of the attorneys for Johnson, flew to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals to file the brief with Justice Joseph C. Hutchison of Houston, who Fortas expected would outright reject Johnson's request, and he actually did. That evening, Fortas's law firm telephoned Justice Black to ask if he would hear the application for a stay, and he said that he would do that. And again, with that being the case, Wikipedia was wrong because they said for some odd reason that Hugo Black was on the circuit court when we know that Joseph C. Hutchison was the circuit court judge that turned it down. So Wikipedia just totally misses this. So even if they say there's a citation, make sure to check it yourself. On September 27th, a day before Hugo Black would hear the application, the 2 masters in chancery started their work. William Robert Smith would investigate Jim Wells County, and J.M. Mac Burnett would investigate Zapata and Duval counties. They said that they would have their written conclusions finished by October 2nd. But still, if Smith was able to get the Precinct 13 boxes open, and the proof of the fraud was open to the public, then even if Johnson was able to be put on the ballot, it might tarnish his chances of winning, or if he actually won, the Senate might refuse to seat him. Johnson did not want those boxes open and needed Hugo Black to approve his application for a stay before the opening of the boxes commenced. It was another race against the clock. William Robert Smith, getting no cooperation from local authorities as to the information and location of the boxes from Precinct 13, asked for all the boxes in Jim Wells County to be open. Johnson's attorney strongly opposed this, saying that this was a federal jurisdiction interference in a state matter, but Smith didn't care. Smith thought that since local authorities were on purposely slowing down this investigation, he would open all the boxes until they found proof. That night, all the boxes were brought to Smith, and the opening of the boxes would start the next morning. On Tuesday, the same day that Hugo Black was considering Johnson's application, the opening of the boxes was to start. In the Washington hearing, both Stevenson and Johnson's attorneys made the same argument, with Stevenson's people saying that this was a civil rights violation, and Johnson's attorney, Abe Fortas, saying that it was a matter of jurisdiction and that a federal court shouldn't interfere with election results. In Alice, all of the ballot boxes were now in the courtroom. Smith asked Louis Sellis, the election judge for Precinct 13, which one of the boxes was Precinct 13. Sellis said that the box wasn't there, as well as other statements purely to delay the hearing in case Justice Black handed down his decision on the stay. That afternoon, Hugo Black agreed with the Johnson campaign and ordered a stay so that the case could be heard by the Supreme Court, but decided to write up his decision the following day. However, Smith contacted Judge Davidson to ask for further instruction, but Smith said that he hadn't been informed of the stay or any of the details, so continue with the investigation. Therefore, Smith started opening the boxes of Jim Wells County and got through the first few and adjourned for the day to pick up the opening of the boxes on Wednesday morning. On Wednesday morning, Smith continued to open the boxes, but Johnson's attorneys employed every delay tactic possible. However, at 1:15 p.m., Hugo Black's stay order was released and the investigation was to be stopped until the Supreme Court case was heard. On October 5th, the Supreme Court refused to move any further. With that, the 7 boxes remaining in Jim Wells County would never be open. Lyndon Johnson's name would be listed as the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate. But were these votes fake? The person who was in charge of Precinct 13 on Election Day was Louis Sellis. In 1977, 4 years after Johnson had died, Sellis gave an interview to the Associated Press claiming that there was indeed fraud committed in Precinct 13. Sellis said that 3 days after the runoff, he met at George Parr's office with Lyndon Johnson, George Parr, Ed Lloyd, a Jim Wells County Democratic Executive Committee member, and Bruce Ainsworth, an Alice City Commissioner. Johnson said, "If I could get 200 more votes, I got this one." Parr then said to Sellis in Spanish, "We need to win the election. I want you to add 200 votes." However, Sellis already had given the tally sheet to Givens Parr, George Parr's brother, with the original 765 votes on it. Sellis told Parr, who then told Johnson, that he would be able to add the 200 votes. As far as the names, Sellis said that he saw 2 men enter the Adams building in Alice to alter the votes. One of the men took the voter poll tax roll and just started adding names of those who hadn't voted. Contrary to Caro's book, Sellis said that none of the people who were on the list were dead. After the names were added, Sellis certified the results, but told Parr that the names had been in alphabetical order and then the same handwriting, and the ink was a dead giveaway that they had been added. Of course, Johnson would go on to be a U.S. Senator and then Majority Leader of the Senate, then Vice President, and then the President of the United States upon the assassination of John F. Kennedy. One of his campaign managers, John Connally, would go on to be governor of Texas and shot in the same event that eventually led to Johnson's presidency. Coke Stevens would retire from politics altogether. George Parr would slowly lose power in the counties he controlled, and in 1974, 26 years after the election, he would be found guilty of tax evasion, and Abe Fortas would go on to be on the Supreme Court. And that is a story about how Lyndon Johnson stole the U.S. Senate seat, which changed the course of history, to be quite honest. While the proof was never presented, Sellis's interview in 1977 clearly showed that Johnson was not the rightful winner, and so goes politics. And with that, thank you all very much for joining me for this video. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you have any recommendations for videos in the future, please put them down below. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel. And also in the first comment is a link to the Patreon for this channel. It'd be great to have you on board. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.